Chapter 2 New Year's Pig. Luann Rees lived in Tucson, but though of herself as just an ordinary Kentuckian a long way from home, she had acquired her foreign last name from her husband, Angel. As it turned out, this was the only part of him that would remain with her. He left on Halloween. 3 years before, on Christmas Day, Angel had an accident, a very bad accident, in his pickup truck. It left him with an artificial leg below the knee, and something else that was harder to pin down. Luann often would get the feeling he didn't really like her, or anyone else for that matter. He blamed people for things beyond their control. Luann was now pregnant with her first, which was due in 2 months. She hoped that more than anything that it wouldn't be born on Christmas Day. She had been thinking about herself and Angel splitting up for even longer than she had been pregnant. But she didn't particularly do anything about it. That was Luann's method. She expected that a divorce would just develop, like a pregnancy, that eventually they would reach some kind of agreement without having to discuss it. This isn't how it worked out. When she began to turn away from him in bed at night, and to get up quietly in the mornings to cook him his eggs, Angel seemed to accept this. Possibly, he thought she was worried about the baby. Later, when the arguments resumed, they had a hopeless quality that Luann had not experienced before. The arguments made her feel that her bones were made of something like the rubber in a Gumby doll, that her body would be bent into any shape and would stay that way. She would sit at the kitchen table, tracing her fingers over the artificial knots in the wood formica tabletop, while Angel paced back and forth, and accused her of thinking he wasn't good enough. He listed names of people, mostly friends of his she could barely remember having met, and asked her if she had slept with them, or if she had wanted to. Angel limped so slightly it was barely noticeable, but there was just the faintest jingling sound with every other step. It was probably something he could have gotten adjusted if he hadn't been too proud to take it into the prosthetic shop. No matter how loud his voice became, Luann could still hear the jingle. She could never think of anything to say that would change the course of these arguments, and so they went on and on. Once, several years before, she had become so frustrated with Angel that she threw a package of bologna at him. They both laughed, and it ended the argument. Now she didn't have the strength to get up and open the refrigerator. Finally he had said it was because of his leg, and no matter what she said, he wouldn't hear it any other way. She more or less gave up talking, and when she lay on her back at night, she felt it was the guilt weighing down on her aching spine instead of the baby. She could remember wheeling him down the white corridor at the hospital to bring him home, just 2.5 weeks after the accident. She had felt filled and proud. Everything she loved in the world was in that chair. Having nearly lost Angel made him all the more precious. One of the doctors said that his boot had probably saved his life, and she felt like kissing it, although in all the confusion no one knew exactly where it had ended up. The boot had caught on the door frame, causing him to be dragged several hundred yards along with the truck as it spun into the irrigation ditch along Highway 86 west of Tucson. The damage to the truck was surprisingly minor. There was a bottle of Jim Beam in the cab that wasn't even broken. He lost his leg because of being twisted and dragged, but the doctor said that he had been thrown from the vehicle at such high speed he would have died instantly. It crossed Luann's mind that he might have just been saying this because Luann was so upset about losing a leg, but she decided it would be best to take the doctor's word for it. When he came home, Luann gave up her part-time job at the Three Bears day school to be with him, insisting that they would get along fine on his disability pay until he was able to go back to work at the bottling plant. She spent 3 weeks playing gin rummy with Angel on the bed and running out to Leasing's Market to get whatever he wanted. She loved the way he asked for things specifically, like Miss Smith's Pound Cake or Beefaroni. She wouldn't have guessed Angel had even noticed that things came in different brand names, other than beer. It was their best time together. Never at any time was Luann repulsed by the amputation. After his stump had healed, it didn't bother her to touch it. It was, which Angel himself would never do. It had a smooth, defenseless look to it that reminded her of a penis. Something she had always thought seemed out of place on a man's body. When he got the prosthesis, she was fascinated at first by the way it was put together, and then thought nothing of it at all. It was something that lay on the floor by his side of his bed at night, while the cat, Snowboots, lay curled up by hers. It took Angel some time to get used to the new leg, but in the long run there was very little he could do with it, except that he was no longer able to wear cowboy boots. For some reason the ankle hinges were not flexible enough to fit into a boot. Other than this, Luann could never see why the accident needed to change his life at all. He hadn't been a cowboy for years anyway. On the Friday Angel left, he had long since gone back to work. He probably didn't think about it being Halloween, only that it was payday. Luann didn't think of any part of this, of course, since she had no idea that it was a particular day her husband had decided to leave her. Luann was in Dr. Palanowski's waiting room, waiting for her 7th-month prenatal exam. She had a magazine on her lap, or what was left of her lap, but preferred to stare instead at an enormous wall calendar that showed all the months at once. She was anxious about her child's birthday. Christmas had been difficult for Angel and Luann since the accident, naturally, and they had just about stopped celebrating altogether. Having a baby on that day would just be a reminder. And besides, she had read in McCall's that children with Christmas birthdays often feel cheated out of having their own special day. I feel you. Not really. Luann thought being born the day after, when everybody is fed up with celebrating, would just be much worse. She decided to ask the doctor if there was some way to make sure the baby would come before Christmas, although she's pretty sure there wasn't. Dr. Palanowski's nurses seemed to like him, and called him Dr. P. Luann thought this was a hoot because he was OBGYN, a maternity doctor, which all starts when you bring in a jar of pee. She had to keep from laughing out loud whenever she heard the nurses call it over the intercom. Dr. P! Dr. P! A nurse with crispy-looking white hair and a lavender pantsuit came out and called Luann's name. She called her Mrs. Angel Ruiz. Angel would always correct Anglos when they pronounced his name wrong. Angel, he would say. I'm not a dang baseball team. But Luann rarely corrected anybody on anything. Her mother, Miss Logan, still pronounced neither Angel's first name nor the last name correctly, saying it something like ruins. She hadn't wanted Luann to marry Angel in the first place, but for the wrong reasons. She disliked him because he was Mexican, which didn't make the slightest difference to Luann. In Tucson, she tried to explain to her mother there were so many Mexicans that people didn't think of them as a foreign race. There were doctors, bank clerks, TV personalities, and even owned hotels. You can see them any day of the week eating at a Black Angus steakhouse, she told her mother. Miss Logan, who lived in eastern Kentucky and had never seen a Mexican, thought Luann was making this up. Dr. Palanowski examined her. He warned again that she was gaining too much weight. Originally, he had thought it might be twins, but now they knew for sure that it was just Luann and the baby. This time his warning his warning about her weight was more severe. For Luann, who had always been practically underweight according to the doctor's office charts, it was impossible to imagine she wouldn't be exactly the same after it was all over. but she had to admit the baby made her want to eat constantly. She told Dr. Pelinowski that it's hard when you're in the kitchen cooking for someone all the time. He told her to put her husband on a diet too. He meant it as a joke. On her way out, the nurse gave her a pamphlet with a special diet written out in both English and Spanish. She thought about asking for a second copy to send to her mother. After 4 years, Luann still felt that she had to prove her point about Mexicans, and so she would send clippings from the newspaper when they were promoted to company vice presidents and such. Luann realized, though, that this pamphlet didn't fall into that category. Her mother was no doubt already convinced that Mexicans had babies like anyone else. In fact, she had told Luann that from what she heard, they had too many, that they were trying to take over the world like the Catholics. I take offense to that. Luann hadn't yet broken the news that when babies were born, the plan was to give it a Catholic baptism. This would be the sake of Angel's mother, who frequently claimed to be dying from any one of various diseases. The only English words she knew were the names of diseases. Luann made the baptism decision purely for practical reasons. If one of the grandmothers was going to have a conniption, it might as well be the one who was 1,800 miles away, rather than one who lived right across town. Luann looked over the pamphlet while she waited for the bus. Like most of the other literature she had received, it had a picture on the front of a mother holding a baby. Sometimes the women in the pictures were white, sometimes Mexican, and sometimes black. They were shown holding their babies in various positions, but they were never shown as pregnant. Luann wondered about this, since all the pamphlets were about prenatal care. On the bus, she decided it must have to do with the fact that the pamphlets were put together by men who, in their opinion, liked the looks of a mother and baby better than a pregnant woman. She was fairly sure about this. On the bus, for instance, several men would stand up to offer her a seat, but they wouldn't quite look at her. The high school boys didn't make remarks under their breath or try to rub up against her when the bus made sudden stops and turns. To be able to relax this way on a crowded bus was a new experience for Luann, and she thought that in some ways it would not be so bad to go through her whole life as a pregnant lady. She watched the houses and the telephone poles go sailing by. Some of the telephone poles had advertisements for Tania Maria, a woman leaning forward in a loose sweater and spike heels. She was a singer that had enough hair for at least 2 people. Other telephone poles had black posters with letters that appeared to be cut out of newspapers, like the ransom notes in mystery novels. But they were ads for bands with names like Audio Confusion and Useless Turmoil and the Meat Puppets. She thought of naming her baby Tania Maria. Angel would suggest naming it something like Meat Puppet. That'd be his idea of a joke. It was a pure pleasure not to have men pushing into her and touching her on the bus. It allowed her mind to drift far away from the strange, enormous body. When she was 9, her grandfather Ormsby had given her a jackknife, and had told her, for his safety's sake, she should always keep a magic circle around her when she used it. She would sit in the backyard and draw a circle in the dirt that no one could come into while she whittled for hours and hours on a thick brown bars of soap. The jackknife was long gone now, but once again there was something like a magic circle around her.